There is a specific kind of geopolitical tension that does not announce itself with gunfire or diplomatic ultimatums. It announces itself with radar contacts, with the slow, deliberate movement of large vessels across a contested stretch of water, tracked by satellites, monitored by intelligence agencies, and watched by every trading desk and defense ministry on the planet. On March 4th, 2026, that tension materialized in the most consequential form it has taken since the end of the Cold War. People's Liberation Army Navy surface combatants, guided missile destroyers of the Type 052D class, among the most capable surface warfare platforms in the Chinese fleet, were confirmed by satellite imagery and maritime tracking systems to be operating in close escort formation with Chinese state-owned very large crude carriers in the Gulf of Oman. Their heading was unambiguous. They were moving toward the Strait of Hormuz, toward the waterway that the United States Fifth Fleet had been patrolling in force since the opening of Operation Epic Fury, toward the choke point that the IRGC had declared closed and the Western insurance market had declared uninsurable, toward the most contested 21 nautical miles of ocean on the surface of the Earth. The global economy, watching this movement on satellite feeds and AIS tracking screens, understood immediately what was happening. Not a naval skirmish, not a miscalculation or an accident of proximity. A deliberate, calculated, publicly visible assertion that China would not accept the energy strangulation that the Hormuz closure had imposed on its economy, and that it possessed both the naval capability and the political will to do something about it. The 80-year American monopoly on the security of the world's ocean trade routes was being challenged in real time by the one power that had both the strategic incentive and the fleet to make the challenge credible, to track the invisible shifts in global hegemony before they reach mainstream coverage, and to understand the macroeconomic architecture driving the decisions that are rewriting the world order in real time. Make sure you are subscribed to this intelligence feed. What follows is an analysis of the most consequential naval standoff since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Not because shots have been fired, but because the decision about whether shots will be fired carries consequences that extend to every market, every supply chain, and every strategic relationship in the global system. Chapter 1 requires stepping back from the immediate tactical picture to understand the historical architecture that the March 4 confrontation is challenging. The Pax Americana on the high seas is not a treaty, not a formal agreement, and not a document that any government signed. It is an informal but operationally precise arrangement that emerged from the ashes of World War II and has governed the security of global maritime trade for 8 decades. Its foundational premise is simple. The United States Navy, as the world's dominant naval power, guarantees the freedom of navigation that allows commercial shipping to operate under the assumption that sea lanes are a shared commons rather than a contested domain. This guarantee has never been entirely unconditional. The U.S. Navy has used its dominance selectively, enforcing freedom of navigation when it served American interests, tolerating violations when the cost of enforcement exceeded the benefit, and deploying its presence as a signal of commitment to allies whose security calculations depend on the credibility of American power projection. But the foundational guarantee that no single regional power would be permitted to close the world's critical maritime choke points to commercial traffic has been the load-bearing pillar of the global trading system since 1945. It is the assumption embedded in every maritime insurance pricing model, every shipping company's route planning, every energy company's supply chain architecture. The commercial insurance market that Lloyd's of London administers exists at a foundational level on the assumption that the U.S. Navy will not allow the world's most critical waterways to remain closed indefinitely. That assumption is what makes maritime risk priceable, because priceable risk assumes an upper bound on the severity of disruption, and that upper bound has historically been provided by the certainty of eventual American naval enforcement. What the Chinese planned escort operation challenges on March 4th is not primarily the tactical control of the Strait of Hormuz. It challenges the assumption that underwrites the entire architecture. If China can punch a hole in the Hormuz closure using its own naval power, transiting its tankers through a waterway that the U.S.-led coalition has implicitly been controlling through the combination of military presence and insurance market withdrawal, then the U.S. Navy's guarantee of maritime security is revealed as conditional in a way it has never publicly been before. Conditional on China choosing not to contest it. And China has just demonstrated that it is willing to contest it. The strategic logic of Beijing's decision is not difficult to reconstruct, and it follows directly from the energy dependency mathematics that the preceding analysis has documented. China's economy requires approximately 11 million barrels of crude oil per day to sustain the industrial output, electricity generation, and manufacturing capacity on which its economic growth and political stability depend. Approximately 40 to 45% of that supply originates in or transits through the Persian Gulf. The IRGC closure declaration, combined with the Lloyd's insurance withdrawal, had effectively cut that supply corridor without a single Chinese vote, a single Chinese diplomatic consultation, or a single Chinese institutional input into the decision. The energy strangulation of the Chinese economy was being imposed by the convergence of Iranian military action and Western insurance market mechanics, two systems operating in concert to produce an outcome whose economic cost to China was equivalent to a deliberate blockade without any of the diplomatic or legal formalities that a deliberate blockade would require. From Beijing's perspective, the choice presented was not between accepting an energy embargo and risking a naval confrontation with the United States. It was between accepting a slow economic strangulation that would compound over weeks and months into genuine industrial contraction and social instability, or demonstrating that China possessed the naval capability and strategic resolve to secure its own energy supply chains when the commercial system failed to provide a pathway for doing so. The second option carries risks. But the first option, evaluated over a timeline of 60 to 90 days of sustained supply disruption, carries consequences that the Chinese Communist Party's political legitimacy cannot absorb. Chapter 2 is where the analysis reaches its most consequential dimension, the strategic dilemma that the planned escort operation has placed in the lap of the United States military and the political leadership that commands it. The dilemma is not a close call. It is a trap whose two exits lead to destinations that are each, in their own way, catastrophic for the strategic position of the United States. The first exit is interception. U.S. Fifth Fleet assets intercept the Chinese escort formation before it reaches the strait. Communicate clearly that the waterway is closed to all traffic, and enforce that communication with the credible threat of kinetic engagement if the Chinese formation does not reverse course. This exit preserves the integrity of the Hormuz blockade as an instrument of economic pressure against the fragmented remnants of the Iranian state apparatus. It maintains the operational principle that the U.S. Navy controls access to the world's most critical energy transit corridor during a conflict in which the United States is a belligerent. And it risks a naval confrontation between the surface combatants of the world's two largest economies and most capable nuclear-armed powers in a confined waterway, where the probability of miscalculation, communication failure, and escalation is not theoretical. A U.S. warship that fires on a planned destroyer, or a planned destroyer that fires on a U.S. warship in the Strait of Hormuz does not produce a localized naval incident that diplomats resolve over weeks of negotiation. It produces a crisis whose escalation dynamics have no reliable ceiling and whose economic consequences, the simultaneous financial, trade, and monetary shock of a direct U.S.-China military confrontation, exceed the combined impact of every economic crisis of the preceding century. The global financial system is not designed to price a direct superpower naval war. It is designed to assume that the deterrence framework preventing such a war holds. The moment it does not hold, the assumption fails, and every asset price in every market in the world requires simultaneous repricing against a new baseline whose parameters no model has ever been asked to generate. The second exit from the dilemma is passage. U.S. Fifth Fleet assets stand down as the Chinese escort formation transits the strait with its tanker convoy, either through explicit communication that Chinese vessels will not be intercepted, or through the more politically manageable ambiguity of simply not positioning U.S. assets to block the Chinese formation's path. This exit avoids the kinetic confrontation whose escalation risks are unbounded. It preserves the U.S.-China relationship's structural architecture at a moment when the consequences of its rupture are too severe to contemplate. And it permanently, publicly, and irrevocably demonstrates that the United States will not enforce the Hormuz closure against a great power that chooses to contest it with naval force. The strategic consequence of that demonstration is not limited to the immediate tactical situation in the strait. It communicates to every regional actor, every energy importing economy, and every potential future challenger of U.S. maritime dominance that the American naval guarantee is conditional on the challenger's decision not to field sufficient naval power to contest it. Saudi Arabia, watching from across the Gulf, recalibrates its security dependence on the United States against the demonstrated reality that American naval power will accommodate Chinese national interests when those interests are backed by destroyers. India, whose own energy dependence on Gulf supply creates parallel strategic incentives to China's, observes that self-help, building the naval capacity to escort one's own energy supply, is the rational response to a maritime security architecture whose guarantor has just revealed its limits. Every state in Asia that has been hedging between the U.S. security umbrella and Chinese regional influence watches the passage of the Chinese convoy and updates its assessment of where the effective center of gravity in the Indo-Pacific security order now lies. The market's response to the standoff reflects the precision with which institutional investors have mapped these two exits and their respective consequences. Defense stocks moved on the interception risk. The probability-weighted value of a U.S.-China kinetic confrontation feeding into the earnings expectations of the defense industrial base, whose production would be required to sustain it. Maritime shipping stocks moved on the passage scenario. the probability-weighted value of a Chinese-secured Hormuz transit corridor, partially restoring the commercial shipping volumes whose cessation had been compressing freight earnings since the Lloyd's withdrawal. The volatility of both is high because the market, like the U.S. military planners watching the radar screens, cannot determine which exit the confrontation will take. And the volatility is asymmetric. The downside of the interception scenario is discontinuous, a jump to a new regime of U.S.-China confrontation whose economic implications cannot be modeled within any framework calibrated on historical data. The upside of the passage scenario is real, but bounded. A partial reopening of Gulf energy supply that relieves some of the stagflationary pressure documented in the preceding analysis, but that comes embedded in a strategic cost, whose magnitude is not immediately visible in any price on any screen. The strategic cost of passage is the devaluation of the American Maritime Guarantee, an asset that does not appear on any balance sheet, but that underlies the pricing of maritime insurance, the feasibility of global supply chains, and the economic architecture of the post-World War II trading system. When that guarantee is revealed as conditional, the commercial system that was built on its unconditionality must eventually reprice. Not immediately, not in a single discontinuous move that markets can absorb and recover from, but incrementally over the months and years following the March 4 standoff, as every maritime insurer, every shipping company, every energy company, and every sovereign wealth fund recalibrates its exposure to a world in which the sea lanes are secured not by a single dominant naval power, but by a competition between armed escorts representing competing national interests. That recalibration is the transition from a unipolar ocean to a multipolar ocean, and its economic consequences are not the dramatic, visible shock of a naval battle, but the slow, compounding friction of a trading system that must now incorporate the cost of great power naval competition into every transaction that crosses an ocean. The container ship that previously transited the Strait of Malacca under the implicit protection of the American Naval Guarantee now transits under the implicit uncertainty of a maritime order in which the United States and China are both present, both armed, and both willing to use their naval assets to enforce their respective national interests. That uncertainty does not close the strait. It taxes it. Every voyage now carries a geopolitical risk premium that the commercial insurance market must incorporate. A premium that reflects not the probability of a specific incident, but the structural uncertainty of operating in a maritime domain that is no longer governed by a single unchallenged authority. The price of that premium is not yet visible in published insurance rates. It will be, as the actuarial models that underwrite maritime commerce are revised to reflect the new competitive reality of the ocean, a reality in which Chinese naval power has demonstrated the capacity and willingness to contest American maritime dominance at the world's most critical choke point. The cost of moving goods and energy across the oceans will increase, not dramatically, not in a single repricing event that markets can observe and adjust to, gradually, persistently, and structurally, embedded in the baseline cost of maritime commerce in a way that will take years to fully measure and decades to fully understand. The March 4 standoff in the Strait of Hormuz will eventually be resolved, through passage or interception, through diplomatic negotiation or tactical maneuvering, through some combination of face-saving gestures that allows both powers to claim they did not capitulate. The specific resolution matters, but it matters less than the fact that the standoff occurred, that China fielded a naval escort and directed it toward a waterway controlled by the U.S. military, that the United States was required to choose between accommodation and confrontation with a great power whose naval capability made the choice genuinely difficult, that the commercial insurance market, the global shipping industry, and the energy systems of 3 continents watched that choice being made from the sidelines, unable to operate until it was resolved, aware that the resolution would permanently alter the security architecture on which their operations depend. Trade is no longer free in the sense that economists and historians have used that term since the mid-20th century. It is not free because the naval power that guaranteed its freedom has encountered a challenger capable of contesting that guarantee. It is tribal, organized around the national interests of the powers that can afford to field the naval assets required to secure their own supply chains. And it is armed, because in a multipolar ocean, the right of passage is not a legal principle enforced by a single dominant authority. It is a capability demonstrated by warships, reasserted on every contested transit, and paid for not by insurance premiums but by defense budgets. The radar screens are still tracking the Chinese formation. The decision has not yet been made. But the world that exists after the decision, whichever way it goes, is already a different world than the one that existed before the planned destroyers turned toward the strait. That is the true cost of the Hormuz standoff. Not the tactical outcome of a single naval confrontation, the permanent recalibration of who controls the oceans, and what that control costs the global economy to maintain,